Well, welcome to you here in the audience and to those of you both listening and viewing online and on the air. We're very lucky to have Nicholas here today. He's a noted expert and first of all, thank you for your many years of service to the United States government.
Thank you. It's kind of you to say that.
You've served in, of course, the State Department and in the White House and in your role as in counterterrorism. And that is the theme of tonight's program, which is terrorism. And as it is stated, defeating hate, addressing violent extremism and terrorism around the globe. And terrorist threats have really become a part of our everyday lives. And our everyday existence, whether going through a metal detector to get to a public school or to enter a public building, or the visible, everyday, ever-present TSA reminder that we have at airports. That consciousness in contemporary society is really traceable in many ways to those horrific days and that attack both on the Pentagon and on the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001. And that event also had an effect on your life. You were working within the diplomatic sphere, and it seemed that it changed the trajectory of your world, because 6 days later, you signed on to start working on counterterrorism.
I did, and it was one of those moments that your career is at a pivot point where what you had been doing before suddenly transitions, and you don't know it at the time, but then 17, 18 years later, you can look back and say, wow, that really was a turning point. I had been asked, had done an interview with Condoleezza Rice at the National Security Council. She was President Bush's national security advisor. And I was taking up a staff position in the Office of Transnational Threats, which dealt with terrorism, but with other transnational threats. And I had done that in the July-August period of 2001. So again, maybe 6 weeks ahead of 9/11. And just by sheer twist of fate, the first day we had set with the human resources folks was, why don't you come in and start on September 16th? That's a Monday. That's a pay period starting point. Let's do that. So I had, of course, no idea that I would be stepping into a kind of an environment that was of the sort that we were experiencing as a country after 9/11. And what was at the time a relatively small office at the White House focused on organizing counterterrorism efforts quickly became a much larger office as our government tried to reorient itself and to develop a whole new set of capabilities to do, Marcos, exactly what you just described, begin to develop an architecture to defend ourselves and to put ourselves in a position that we would never again have to experience what we experienced on 9/11. So,
well, transnational terrorism really seems to have increased over my lifetime with the increasing amount of and ease of mobility, the availability of weaponry, certainly the friction-free global communication systems that allow us to both experience the beauty of being able to speak with someone as far in far-off parts of the world, but also the challenges that immediate, instantaneous, friction-free communication poses as a challenge to the work that you do. So perhaps you can frame kind of what it is that we're looking at in this contemporary, 2019 world. We have really in two buckets, the global challenges that exist, transnational terrorism, but we also have the domestic side of it. So maybe we'll look at it, and I'll let you start wherever you want to start, whether it's global or domestic.
Well, if we'd been having this conversation in the kind of immediate period after 9/11, we'd have been focused in pretty narrowly on a set of problems. Big problems, but I would argue narrow problems. We were facing a group in Al-Qaeda that had done the worst to us. They had managed to carry out this catastrophic attack against the United States homeland that killed many thousands of our fellow citizens. But they were still largely a known commodity in a sense. They were a clandestine organization. They operated in a cell-like structure, and we had intelligence capabilities that allowed us to understand that cell structure and to, over time, develop a pretty comprehensive understanding of how they were structured so that we could basically go after the leadership of the organization and degrade the leadership of the organization and in a sense eliminate many of the key actors who were tied to that 9/11 attack.
Right. We'd had sort of that indication from the earlier attempts to attack the World
Exactly.
Trade, not the World Affairs Council, the World Trade Center,
Sure.
and of course recognized what was going on in Afghanistan and had even
Exactly.
attacked some of those cells, or at least
Exactly.
attempted to attack them during the Clinton administration.
But globally, the numbers of bad actors in this space were still relatively modest, relatively small. I guess if you flash forward to today, what I guess would, as much good news as there is in terms of our ability now to defend ourselves, the kind of robust homeland security architecture that we've developed through a huge amount of investment, and TSA is now a part of our lives in ways that they weren't at the time of 9/11. But the problem in some ways is a wider and deeper problem than it was at the time of 9/11. A Washington think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, put out a study last fall that kind of did a raw aggregate number of, if you look at all the different estimates of membership, the membership is a loose concept, but membership in terrorist organizations around the world that we can identify. And that if you add up all of the kind of estimates, there were probably on the order of 3 to 4 or maybe even 5 times the number of people who subscribe to this extremist ideology akin to what Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State follow. The number of people who kind of fall under this umbrella is 3 to 4 to 5 times higher in gross raw terms than at the time of 9/11. So just as a matter of grand strategy in terms of how we, the United States, and our friends around the world are confronting the problem, obviously, there are things we're doing well, but if that is at bottom a metric, it's not a good metric. It
Right.
means there are thousands and thousands of more individuals who subscribe to this, hateful ideology who want to do us harm than there were at the time of 9/11. Okay, how do we explain that? How do we respond to that? Those are big questions.
Well, that is interesting because what you're saying is there's, on the one hand, a complexity that's grown because it's no longer these identifiable cells. It's a growth industry. I mean, if they've grown that many fold since 9/11, then certainly something is going on that we aren't addressing with the huge investment, thirdly, that you suggested. And if you were to put it in gross terms, in terms of the investment that the United States has made to try and deal with this issue that is clearly not being suppressed, if it is in fact growing, what kind of a number would you throw out? Are we talking trillions?
I wasn't told there would be math.
Oh, okay.
But I'll just say there was a period of time late in the Obama administration when President Obama was struggling with questions about whether to sustain our military involvement in Afghanistan, and if so, at what levels. And I know one of the things that weighed on President Obama was how can we be in a situation where year after year after year we are spending on the order of 20, 30, 40 billion dollars a year in that one theater alone, and we are putting our young men and women in harm's way by having them serve in a wartime setting, and not getting out of that investment, recognizable return. And so if that's just one theater, 20, 30, 40 billion dollars a year, as an investment in our own security, that is simply, it wasn't paying off in the way it should. But part of the reason the problem has grown so exponentially in terms of the numbers I described earlier, Marcus, is what you described. It's that the tools of modern communication enable terrorist organizations and enable the ideology that underpins terrorist organizations to spread more freely and more easily across the globe. It is no longer the case that a terrorist organization has to meet you, recruit you, bring you into their training camp in order to vet you and understand your motivations and send you back, deploy you back to whatever country you're from in order to put you in motion as an operative of that terrorist organization. Now all of that interaction can happen very quickly and in a very friction-free communication style, so that it can all happen between individuals who've never met each other, never been physically in the same place, and with all of that engagement being entirely virtual. So in a sense, it's a radical democratization of the terrorism movement, or at least this particular piece of the terrorism movement, where they can reach to individuals who may have nothing in common with them other than they share the ideology, and they make themselves into fellow travelers.
Right. So you're flattening the structure in essence, where it used to be somewhat pyramidal and you'd have to have these leaders and the cells to be able to actually follow the directions. You can now actually spread this fairly wide.
You can, and actually, I think one of the things that the Islamic State, ISIS, came to realize was that there was tremendous value to their cause in not going for the home run, in not trying to mimic what Al-Qaeda had done to us with 9/11, which was very complex, very difficult, and to be fair, or to be honest, very hard to replicate. It was, there was a reason we didn't have follow-on 9/11 attacks. It in part was because of the defense and homeland security architecture we built, but it's a hard thing to do, to put together a complex, multi-phase plot that involves all these moving pieces. It is far less hard to motivate an individual to pick up a gun or a knife or jump into the driver's seat of a vehicle and just do something, strike out, carry out a violent act, kill somebody, but do so in the name of this terrorist ideology. And so it's been, as I said, kind of a radical flattening or democratization of the terrorism movement. Now, there's good news embedded in this, as much as I make it sound awful. There's good news in that it's very, very difficult for terrorist organizations to reach the level of planning and organization necessary to carry out a 9/11 attack. And so we are, I would argue, far, far, far less vulnerable today than we were at the time of 9/11 to that kind of attack.
Right, so fewer grand-scale types of attacks on the homeland or even an international sphere.
Exactly, and usually those kinds of attacks take many months to build. Their gestation periods are long, and that actually gives us, in a sense, the good guys, a long window of opportunity to gain the necessary intelligence, identify who the kind of key bad actor is, to either use law enforcement, military, or intelligence tools to kind of get that person taken care of, dealt with, either arrested, or if it's in a battlefield setting, a kinetic solution, if we're in a wartime setting. So in a sense, that really far end of the problem set we are less vulnerable to, and that's a good thing. But this other part of the problem set, this more random, seemingly random, could happen anywhere, could be carried out by anybody, that in some ways has its own unnerving effect. It makes people feel less secure, less comfortable in their surroundings. It's not something that's only a metropolitan problem. Yes, it's a New York City problem, but it's also a problem, or could be a problem, in most any community in the United States.
Sure, and the tools for being able to carry out any such attack are available everywhere. And of course, the question is, once you have individuals who don't have an infrastructure other than what it is that is motivating them within their own minds that they don't necessarily share, that they can go out and perhaps cumulatively create just as much damage as a mass attack over time.
If you think back to the United Kingdom, our colleagues and friends in London, it was the early spring, summer of 2017 when the United Kingdom suffered in relatively rapid succession 3 attacks. There was a London attack, then the Manchester attack at the stadium where the large international concert was going on, and then another attack in London, all within about a 90-day period of time. And each of them was relatively, I hate to say the word low level, because it's never low level when individuals lose their lives,
Sure.
But these were largely smaller scale attacks, but they happened in rapid succession. And I kind of wondered to myself at the time, would we in the United States have had the kind of discipline and resilience to respond to that kind of situation with multiple attacks over a condensed period of time? Or would we have simply been compelled to kind of radically change our policies tied to terrorism, or do something? The UK response was very introspective. The United Kingdom looked at what they were doing between their law enforcement intelligence capabilities and more or less said, we're doing the right things. We've just had a run of really, really, not bad luck, but of really bad outcomes, but we are making the right investments. Our police and security services are doing the right things, and we ought to keep doing them. They didn't unmake their system, and I kind of wonder if we would have the ability in our own politics.
Right.
to.
Well, the message.
The answer is no. We would not.
Right. The answer is no. Well, because the message really from the political leadership at the time was what we see sometimes now on poster boards: is keep calm and carry on.
Yes.
And I think you're right in questioning whether or not that would have been the same. Oh, I guess you've answered that. It would not have been the same in the United States,
and that's
right?
without respect to whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
That's right.
Because
This is not a partisan question.
I have a feeling that if whichever party was not in control of government at the time something like that would happen, would hold the other, would raise quite an outcry if we experienced that kind of outcome here in the United States.
And we were even having those debates, even though those attacks had not happened in the United States. We were talking about the trade-offs between civil liberties and security, and that as if there is an equation that if you give up one, then you must absolutely, to achieve another, there is a trade-off there.
And that is something that differentiates us from some of our closest partner countries. You know, as closely as we work with the United Kingdom, and my colleagues in London were as close as any colleagues I had across the globe in terms of the work we were doing on counterterrorism. They do bring a different set of, I wouldn't say values, but they bring a different set of a willingness to engage in certain kinds of preventive measures that we wouldn't find tolerable here. You know, the pervasiveness of closed-circuit TV coverage in London, for example, is probably not something most Americans would be comfortable with here. In every city or every major city. So our UK colleagues do not grapple with questions of First Amendment protected speech, for example, when individuals are engaged in hateful speech that is hateful, but not to the point where it is actually calling on others to commit violent acts.
Right.
They look at us sometimes and kind of a little bit dumbfounded to say, why do you allow certain things to happen? Why do you sit back when we would act?
Right.
So that's true even with our closest partners,
yes.
Where there's a great alignment of values and a great alignment of political views. There's still differences in our traditions.
Right, and where perhaps there is not this state ability to, say, surveil the population with state-owned or police-owned CCTV cameras, we rely a great deal on in the aftermath on privately owned cameras and, and industry that, whether they be shop cameras to be able to identify perpetrators and the like. So it may not be a straight-out trade.
Sure. And there have been cases like the Boston Marathon bombing, cracking that case. The FBI did amazing work in the aftermath of that horrific event by just reaching out to the public and gathering every bit of available cell phone camera footage that was available, and it was literally good old-fashioned police work.
And it was fast.
And it was fast in a way that would amaze you. And that's why, again, when I hear individuals criticize the FBI now, I still view the FBI as the preeminent law enforcement organization in the world. And because if given the opportunity and the tools, they will find a way to get to the bottom of a plot.
Well, some of those individuals happen to be the President of the United States, who also is critical of some of our intelligence and policing organs, and that's unfortunate, but it seems to be the reality these days.
Exactly.
As we look at the types of individuals, because we again have suggested that you've suggested that they've been growing, or you've looked at the numbers and you've found that they are growing. Is there anything that's common to this? Oftentimes, when all you do is listen to television news reporting or the pronouncements coming from the White House, it seems to be very much focused on what is often referred to as radical Islamist terrorism. Mm-hmm. Is that really a reflection of what you're seeing in the growth trends in the terrorist world or in those who are attacking?
Well, certainly the number of the exponential growth in the number of individuals that are attached to this ideology, they are all attaching to this ideology that is a radical Islamist ideology. What motivates them to go there, what motivates them to drop everything from where they live and maybe travel across the world and show up on the doorstep of a conflict zone like Syria. That can be very different, though. And one of the things we tracked very closely during my period of government service was the accumulation of what we were calling terrorist foreign fighters, individuals who were not Syrian, who were not Iraqi, but simply were drawn to the conflict in Syria and Iraq, the ISIS experiment, the idea of a caliphate in the here and now was something that was appealing to them. So that you had individuals from, I think that at one point we had an aggregate number of some 40,000 individuals from around the world, from dozens and dozens of countries around the world, who had either gone to or tried to go to the conflict zone to join into this mix. Not all were doing so for the same set of reasons. For some it was a ideological quest. For some it was a religious duty, so perceived. For some it was pure love of violence and adventure, the same way that young men and sometimes young women of every generation seek out adventure and in some cases even violence. It was not always a theologically grounded decision by an individual to pick up their, pack a suitcase, grab their passport, and say, I'm flying to Turkey so that I can make my way across the border into Syria and fight on behalf of ISIS. Sometimes it was literally nothing more than, my life isn't particularly fulfilling right now, and this is a way that I can make a statement. What does that statement mean? I don't know, but I know I will make a statement.
Right.
So you had, and as we thought about how do you counter this phenomenon, because you have such a wide array of motivations, there's no simple antidote that says, okay, do this and you will dissuade, have scholars and teachers who understand the religious underpinnings of faith explain what is and what isn't permissible. Well, that may not touch the actual motivation. If the person is adventure-seeking or has a violent streak and simply wishes to exercise it on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria, then listening to an imam isn't going to change or alter their behavior. So we found ourselves at a bit of a loss in terms of actually reversing this flow of foreign fighters. It was really only until ISIS began to experience battlefield setbacks, when they began to lose on the ground, when all of a sudden the narrative that everybody had been reading of this organization is winning, this organization is controlling thousands and thousands of square miles of territory, it is a state-like entity, until you could turn that around, you were never going to be able to undermine the kind of the appeal that this ISIS, Islamic State, caliphate had around the world.
And that is one of the things we can look to as a success, is the battlefield success, is the reduction and now the elimination of any territorial holdings by the caliphate itself. That could have multiple other knock-on effects, of course, but in terms of there being somewhere for someone to land, that is a physical, real geographically identifiable territory with leadership and functioning state operations, that is done, and it was being defeated during at the end of the Obama administration, but really was eliminated just recently with the announcement that President Trump made.
Exactly, and again, I was a serving government official across the transition from President Obama to President Trump, and we were already embarked on a strategy that was designed to roll back the physical dimensions of this caliphate, and to do so in a way that was not the most efficient and fastest way to do it, because the most efficient and fastest way to do it would have been a large deployment of U.S. forces on the ground, akin to what we had done during the earlier Iraq War, or certainly what we had done in Afghanistan. But President Obama was determined not to have that be the tool, and as a result, it took longer and was a more deliberate process by working through the Iraqi security services, by eventually identifying a partnering organization inside Syria, the so-called SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. That took longer, but it probably produced a more durable outcome because it was not an outcome that was dependent on 100,000 or 150,000 U.S. troops deployed on the ground in Iraq and Syria. The downside was, of course, that it took, as I suggested, a long time to play out. And in some ways, the campaign where first Mosul, the large Iraqi city, which had been, in a sense, the tipping point when the Islamic State became a caliphate. The campaign, in a sense, played out over a 2 or 3 year period, and so in some ways it was like a very long telegraphed punch. The bad guys knew what our military strategy was. We were executing it, but we were not executing it in a kind of lightning strike fashion. As a result, the ISIS as an organization had a lot of time to prepare for that ultimate eventuality. In a sense, they knew the cards were stacked against them, that they would eventually be displaced from this physical territorial caliphate. But with a long time to plan for that endgame or that outcome, that meant that in some ways they were well prepared when that did come to kind of melt into the kind of hinterland of parts of Iraq and Syria, and then revert to being what ISIS had been previously, a clandestine movement, not a territory holding movement. So in some ways, it's why I hesitate to use words like defeat when talking about ISIS or the Islamic State, because it's very difficult to say that you have defeated this organization when there is every possibility that they could resurge at a certain point.
Sure. I mean, if you're casting those individuals to the winds and they are bringing with them whatever their motivations are, whether they be religious or their perceived duty or strictly a continued interest in adventure, they are now no longer necessarily in that same region. They are able to scatter in the region.
They're either scattered in the region or in some cases scattered well beyond the region. And this, again, during my period in government, one of the things we were focused on is what would happen to all of these individuals in the aftermath of war in Syria and Iraq. Where would these individuals return to their countries of origin? Would they find new theaters in other conflict zones or other hotspots around the world, if that's a Libya or Southeast Asia, parts of the Philippines where ISIS has developed a bit of a presence? There are multiple places around the world where you could point to and say, is this the next place where this, in a sense, global jihad plays itself out? Or alternatively, do these individuals simply seek to return home from whence they came? And if they were from Denver, Colorado, do they return to Denver? Or if they were from Birmingham, England, do they return to Birmingham? And what do they do when they get there? Do they kind of check this off as that chapter of my life is now closed? Or do they, in a sense, hold on to the ideology, hold on to the motivations that drove them to go in the first place, and look to then carry out, their own sets of attacks, in countries where they came from? So I think all of those were things we were very worried about as we kind of watched this caliphate unwind itself.
Right, but one of the things you debunk, I think, in one of the pieces that you've written is the notion that some of these terrorists are in fact using the border or the supposed sieve of the border to enter into the United States and then pursue their jihad, if it were, or whatever terrorist means or goals they have in the United States.
Yeah, when I left government service, I was not seeking in my first year of government, outside of government, to kind of do a bunch of op-ed writing and criticizing of government, because many of my colleagues and friends still remain in government. Yeah. But when I saw some of the way that the border security debate was playing out and the way that the kind of concerns we have about extremism and terrorism were being mushed into the questions about security at the southern border, I wanted to try to disaggregate those two problems. I am not a border security expert. We may have a whole set of problems that need to be solved in terms of our security at the southern border. Whether we have the right set of resources, applied to do that, I'm not the person to ask that. But I can say with great confidence is that one problem we are not facing an infiltration of terrorism-linked individuals across the southern border.
Right. And that was the point, really, I was making as well.
Exactly. And the problem we do face are individuals who are already here, who were born here, who, in a sense, all of their formative years were spent here, almost certainly either a U.S. citizen by birth or by naturalization, or perhaps a legal permanent resident. But the immigration problem and the terrorism problem should by no means be connected in my mind.
So you're facing, and we are facing, because it is not you as a counterterrorism expert alone, it is us as citizens, are facing this much more complex environment where we have multiple orientations and multiple motivations for individuals. We have states that are our allies, or at least strategic allies in a region, and one of them, of course, being Saudi Arabia, that are promoting, in essence, some of the most violent and virulent strains of terrorist-oriented types of, well, it's called Wahhabism, and I know that that's not often referred to as a main source of terrorist ideology. But we have also this ability and the susceptibility to messaging that is not necessarily Saudi underwritten or backed, that also drives those who are within the homeland to act in violent ways. Can you break some of that down? And because there have to be certain strategies for certain types of violence that you are trying to counter.
Sure, and we haven't really kind of gotten to what we in government would call the more purely domestic terrorism set of challenges yet, and we'll come to that maybe in a minute or two.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I think we had come to realize in terms of dealing with the homegrown extremism problem tied to the ideology of an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda, one of the things we'd come to realize was that the solution to that was by and large going to be a local community-based solution. You know, the FBI, with all of the immense respect that I have for the FBI and our intelligence community and our law enforcement community, by and large, we are not going to gather in our typical intelligence gathering indicators that a certain individual in the privacy of their own home or sitting in their mother's basement online has radicalized and is moving down this pathway from being radicalized to actually mobilized to doing something violent. Because that's a lot of that is going on inside someone's head. They aren't even necessarily revealing that to any but their closest associates. So that's a really hard problem for our law enforcement. It's a lot different than kind of busting a cell of terrorists overseas by intercepting their emails or listening in on their phone calls, which we were very good at.
Yeah.
How do you get inside this loop where an individual is doing this, in a sense, literally inside their own head, inside perhaps their own room or basement? Well, the answer is bystanders. Individuals, someone in their environment will have observed changes in behavior, changes in attitude. And during my period at the National Counterterrorism Center, we jointly did a study with FBI on the last half dozen years of cases like this, of individuals who were arrested for some terrorism-related offense. And in 75 or 80% of those cases, there was some individual in the aftermath who kind of stepped forward and said, ooh, I think I saw something, or I was actually wondering about that. Whether it was a parent, a teacher, a coach, a cousin, a teammate in the local sports team, somebody in the aftermath said, wow, I wish I had acted on that gut feeling I had. Well, we understand why it's hard to act on that gut feeling, because going to law enforcement and raising your hand and saying, my friend has been saying some weird things and I'm worried about what he or she might do, that's not something most people like to do. But on the other hand, that's how the FBI, that's how law enforcement know where to devote their resources and who to potentially put some scrutiny on. But that's a very, very difficult project.
I would think that's the most difficult project. I mean, when we caught the Unabomber, it was really a sibling who was able to look at the writings and say, this looks like my brother.
My brother, exactly.
That is, and because I'm not in law enforcement, I'm not sure how rare or how often those types of events occur. But there seems to be, as you say, this difficulty, this divide between civilians and their policing authorities, and making that jump to actually. Yes. So how do you perceive? I mean, I understand the need for it. I recognize the successes of it in the past.
Yep.
But how do you get someone to then make that move and motivate a populace to think on their friends and neighbors?
So one of the things that, when I was still working in government, the FBI director Comey, when he was still in government, used to say was, if I'm involved, meaning I, the FBI, it's too late. because chances are the FBI is involved because somebody has already taken some concrete step. They've acquired a weapon, they've tried to travel to Iraq or Syria, things that are already, in a sense, a violation of our criminal code, and they can be arrested and prosecuted and potentially go to jail for a good long time. So, okay, if that's reality, how do you get in front of that and disrupt that process before it reaches that point? And so, Marcus, what you're asking is how do you get communities to cooperate? Well, you get them to cooperate by demonstrating to them that you have a commitment, we, the government, have a commitment to off-ramping an individual without necessarily there having to be a law enforcement incarceration solution.
Right.
So, and this is hard. This is really hard because what it means is you've got to figure out how do you identify that person at a very early stage before they've broken a law, before they've built a bomb, before they've started to do stuff online that puts them in touch with, bad actors overseas, any of those things that could cause them to go to jail. How do you intervene, develop an intervention model that gets that individual off of that path before they've entered into the FBI zone?
Right.
And that is usually going to be not a law enforcement or intelligence problem, but some other form of community social service provider that actually has the tools to do that, if you can bring them into the equation at an early stage.
Right.
And again, this is all a very, one of the frustrations to me when I was in government service is we were trying to create an architecture in Washington to kind of create these interventions around the country, but what I just described is a very, very local phenomenon. And so if the vision I always had in my head was each major metropolitan area needed to have kind of a task force of all of the different relevant actors, whether there was faith community leaders, social service providers, non-governmental organizations, law enforcement, cops, and all around a table, sitting there with a folder, looking at cases, saying, wow, who's got an idea of how to reach this young person before they go too much further astray than they already are? And hopefully somebody raises their hand and says, I got this one. And they've got a way, whether that's putting them into a new living situation or a new job situation or a new something situation. But it's classic social service provision in some ways. It's not law enforcement and intelligence work. So I guess what I came to realize over the course of a long number of years doing counterterrorism work was that it's not just hard power that works against these terrorism problems, it's often soft power, and the soft power in this case is very localized soft power.
Yeah, because you can defeat individuals and networks, but you can't, or rather networks and cells and the like, but it's very hard to defeat ideas.
Yes.
And these are what are motivating individuals. And if I would add, also in our 21st century reality, where everyone in this room likely has a telephone in their pocket, and if they weren't here sitting with us, might be looking at it, there's this opportunity oftentimes, or rather this demand, and these tools are structured to take your attention. So those community relations that we once had are also being riven in that we don't have necessarily the types of social community groups that in the past perhaps would have been where we would have identified or been able to have had the interactions to recognize that individuals may be going off the rails.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why, again, stepping back to the level of kind of grand strategy, how do we win, how do we solve the problem of terrorism? I would argue we really don't. It just becomes something that we manage and cope with, and that we develop the right degree of societal resilience so that we don't get, in a sense, thrown off our axis every time we face an incident. At my college 30th reunion about 2 years ago, I was given an award as a distinguished alum and was asked to give a short speech. And one of the things I said in that speech was, I worry about terrorism, please you don't. Me and the 1,000 people I work with at the National Counterterrorism Center, your taxpayers, you pay us to do that. We do a good job. The FBI does a terrific job. The CIA, the military do a terrific job. I don't want you, fellow Americans, deciding what to do on your weekend based around whether you're worried about whether you can be in Union Square for a festival or whether you should be, in some public setting or attending some outdoor gathering. And I think that's what our objective should be, to be in a society where we can do those things and not have, not be driven by fear away from doing those things. That's still short of actually eliminating the scourge of terrorism, because I think that's a pretty unattainable set of objectives, particularly, Marcus, so long as you said, the modern tools of communication mean that ideology is going to be very difficult to kind of stamp out or to prevent individuals from accessing that ideology, as much as we might try.
Yeah. At this portion of our program, we usually turn to the audience and they bring up these 3x5 cards, so I get to ask you all kinds of interesting questions that I either was too embarrassed to ask you, or maybe, or really, it really indicates which direction they're interested in going. And so you mentioned domestic terrorism, and this questioner wants to ask about, for example, white supremacists. And he asks, or she asks specifically, do you worry about that trend of domestic terrorism and also specifically the white supremacist movement?
I do, and it's something that really I started to think really hard about just as I was leaving government, because I was, a lot of the structures of government that we created in the aftermath of 9/11 were built with the idea of confronting this international terrorism problem that we faced. So my organization, the National Counterterrorism Center, created by statute, following the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, all of that good stuff, and yet on paper it basically said, yeah, but you won't do domestic terrorism. That's really just the FBI. Let the FBI do that. And that made sense to me, because we had every reason to be focused overseas on the international terrorism problem. But now flash forward, 10, 12, 15 years later, after all those governmental reforms, and it's probably the case that domestic terrorism threatens us here in the United States as much, if not more, than terrorism tied to these ideologies we've been talking about for most of this evening. One of my FBI good friends and colleagues, Mike McGarity, the Assistant Director of the FBI for Counterterrorism, was on the Hill testifying last week on this subject, and he described basically an equal level of effort and an equal level of caseload right now that the FBI devotes to this question of domestic terrorism, which includes white supremacists, organizations and individuals, anti-Semitic organizations and individuals, but other forms of extremism as well, environmental extremism, animal rights extremism. There's a lot of fringe ideology out there. But the point is, when we deal with this form of terrorism in the United States, we largely treat it as a law enforcement problem, and we look to the FBI and say, you guys, you got it. Whereas on the form of terrorism that I've spent most of my career working on, we bring all of the different aspects of the government to the table: the military, the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Homeland Security Department, all of us. And instead, with the domestic form of terrorism, it's just treated more as okay, let's arrest them. And what also complicates the domestic terrorism problem is something I referred to a little bit earlier when comparing us to the United Kingdom. A lot of the speech, a lot of the expressions of ideological view that come out of individuals, hateful, even potentially odious language, but still falling under the category of protected free speech. You can say some pretty hateful things in person and online, and the FBI will not come after you, because it's not what we do.
That's right.
So in the case of the FBI, they're often having to wait until an individual takes a particular act, actually leading to a violent act, before they're able to intervene. And contrast that to the kind of toolkit we have when dealing with international terrorism, what I referred to earlier. If you or someone you know had decided 3 or 4 years ago that you wanted to go fight on behalf of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, you could have been prosecuted and jailed simply for the act of purchasing a ticket to fly to Turkey if we knew from your email that you also intended to cross into Syria and join a terrorist organization. We have a legal framework in place that allows the government to charge you with material support to a terrorist organization. That simple act of wanting to do something on behalf of ISIS, even if you've never picked up a gun, even if you've never built a bomb. So I'm not arguing that we need or want an equivalent set of laws to govern domestic terrorism, but it's clear we bring less oomph to the table when confronting domestic terror than we do international terror. And that may be for good and understandable reasons, again, because we're creeping into the area of freedom of speech, and what today is one form of protected speech might someday be, again, the tables can turn, and somebody's outsider organization today might be an insider organization tomorrow, or vice versa. So the FBI is in a very difficult position, I think, a much harder position in terms of confronting domestic terror.
Right, and some of those debates that you're talking about and those trade-offs are being debated in Congress as we speak.
Absolutely.
And it's on the front burner of many of the legislative agendas to decide what to do about these whether you see them as intrusions or protections,
Sure.
are currently being debated. I have a question here from John Navis, and he asks, and this is specific to a region where you have also spent some of your time at the State Department, in the Middle East, and also in Central Asia. Have drone killings been a net positive or net negative in the rise of global terrorism? So he's asking really, are the means that we use to actually conduct the kinetic activities against those cells, it's often heard that those will breed new terrorists. What's your take on that?
It's a terrific question, and it's one that's very, very difficult to resolve in a data-driven way, because I think everybody who comes to the conversation ends up bringing a view, but a view that isn't necessarily grounded in data. I remember even having these conversations inside the White House Situation Room, and when we would be reviewing options about how to disable a particular terrorist threat in a war zone overseas, and the question of what should we or shouldn't we, use a military tool to go after this particular problem to preempt terrorists before they did something to targets that were important to us. And at times, some of the people arguing around the table would say, yeah, we may succeed in killing those 3 or 4 or 5 terrorists as part of that group, but by doing so, we risk creating hundreds more. Well, that was a great talking point, but it was very difficult to measure or even evaluate whether that was accurate as an actual, compelling point. I guess I leaned in the direction of not buying that kind of argument, because I felt like we were, in the main, very judicious in the use of this technology, this drone technology. In the main, use of this technology was allowing us to go after very specific targets that posed threats to us without having to be indiscriminate in the way that we did so, without having to put large concentrations of troops on the ground, which would invariably put more of our men and women in harm's way, but would also potentially put more civilians on the ground in harm's way because of the kind of conflict that would ensue on the ground in the context of a ground war. So I always felt like, on balance, this tool was a useful tool because it allowed us to be more discriminating and more proportionate in managing and mitigating, and those are kind of antiseptic sounding words, but in actually being somewhat surgical in what we were doing in terms of eliminating terrorist threats. But I can't say that without also having to grant that mistakes get made and were made and are being made and will be made that involve occasionally civilians and innocents being killed in that process. Towards the end of the Obama administration, President Obama very much wanted us to pursue a transparency initiative that would say, be able to show, here's what we do, to the extent we can talk about it consistent with security, and here is the kind of level of cost it has had in terms of collateral or civilian casualties. It is not zero. No one argues that this kind of warfare is mistake-free or clean or does not impose real human costs on the population of the places where we are fighting this war. But as a comparison to the kind of wars that we have fought in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, that level of cost is much, 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 much less.
Right.
So that, but in the end, it ends up being a very personal judgment, and people with whom I have served in government and admire very deeply come out on different sides of the same problem.
Yeah. Well,
It's one of the more difficult problems that we wrestled with inside the White House Situation Room. And one of the things we tried to do was show, through some of the transparency initiatives, that this was not being done, show that this was not being done in a haphazard way, without process, without structure, without real rules guiding what we were doing. This wasn't just simply, go get them, let's drop some bombs.
Right.
Now, whenever you engage in transparency about in decision-making structures inside government, there will be people who think you've gone too far. Why are you telling the bad guys how you do your business? You're letting them know. And there will be people who thought you didn't go nearly far enough because they say it's a bunch of words, but we don't really know who's the decision maker. How, what did he or she, who pulled the trigger? I think President Obama tried to strike that balance.
I think we all take great comfort to know that these debates take place and that individuals like you and your colleagues really struggle with these questions. And ultimately, we as citizens and civilians have to recognize that these decisions do need to be made and that they have costs as well on our own, on our decision makers, but also the UAV pilot who is finally pulling the trigger on some of these individuals. And we've seen that depicted in cinema and other places where...
Well, and that statistic I cited of 2, 3, or 4 times the number of kind of global terrorists that there were at the time of 9/11, you could certainly argue that the reason that number is as large as it is maybe in part tied to the fact that we've carried out this kind of military activity around the globe. This may have been a radicalizing factor to some segment of the individuals who are part of that global terrorism movement. Okay, how do you stack that up against the numbers of times we have, no kidding, disrupted a genuine plot where individuals were destined to do something that would have resulted in the loss of life, not just to Americans, but to friends and partner countries of ours around the world. So that's a very hard thing to weigh one against the other.
Well, again, thank you for sharing that and for really going in depth into that, because I think it affects us in the public in ways it's not always, while it may be transparent as a process, it does not affect us in our daily lives. And
Sure.
I think that we are not confronted with these types of life and death questions on a daily basis as those who are sitting, whether it's in the White House or on the front lines, making these decisions. But I'd like to take us also, since a lot of these strikes took place in Afghanistan, and one of our questioners wants to know how you see the withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan, and I'm going to put it in the context of what it is you do and what you look at, which is in counterterrorism. And let's extend that also to include Syria, because we really are on the verge of taking back all of the U.S. troops, which I think are about 2,000 right now, and the force level will be reduced to about 200, if I'm not mistaken. Not nearly enough to really maintain, whether it's with the Kurdish forces that are working with the U.S. forces, to be able to maintain that northeastern part of Syria.
Sure.
From being overridden or prevented from being attacked by Turkey, for example. A lot there, Syria, Afghanistan, and what it is you look at in whatever amount of time you want to use.
Well, obviously serving in the Obama administration and then serving for a year in the Trump administration, I could catalog for all of you in great detail the differences in style and substance between those two administrations. You can only imagine. But one area where there was I had almost serious flashbacks as I sat in Trump administration deliberations. I had flashbacks to my participation in Obama administration deliberations on the matter of Afghanistan, because as different as President Trump and President Obama are, they both came to the conversation about sustaining our presence in Afghanistan with the same set of questions. I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. How can it be that year after year after year, we send our young men and women into harm's way, we spend billions and billions of dollars, and we don't yet seem to really have turned the tide or produced an outcome or in a sense, won. So is that a sensible way to go about it? Surely that can't be. You're not asking me as president to sign up to 4 or 8 more years of that, are you? And that was a legitimate question from President Trump, expressed differently than it would have been expressed by President Obama. But as I sat there and heard the conversation, I thought to myself, wow, they have every right as a president to ask that question. Why am I as president, cornered, doomed to kind of continue doing this year after year after year? And the only answer I got or heard from around the table, and I won't identify the person who gave the answer, but it helped me think about it, and that was from one of the senior military officials participating in the conversation. At one point described what we were doing in Afghanistan as a very expensive and painful form of life insurance. No one likes year after year after year to stroke a check to the life insurance company for something you hope and expect won't happen, and yet it's your responsibility to your family, to your loved ones, to yourself to do that. Because you hedge against worst case outcomes. And so the argument being made by this one participant in these conversations was, yeah, we do need to stay in Afghanistan. Maybe not at the levels that we're at now, or maybe certainly not at the levels we were at the peak of our involvement, but there needs to be some form of support provided to the Afghan government, our friend and partner, to hedge against worst case outcomes. Because worst case outcomes could bring us back to a day that I don't want to say led us to 9/11, but there certainly was an environment created in Afghanistan at an earlier stage that permitted the growth of Al-Qaeda into the terrorist organization that it became. So does that mean President Trump will buy that argument year after year after year? He may not. I suspect he will want to draw down our presence even further. But I know there will be voices around the table in the White House Situation Room that will be cautioning him that doing so will actually increase the level of risk that we face as a country. Mm-hmm. Syria is a slightly different case because Syria is in some ways even more challenging because it's not clear that there's any negotiated solution to the Syria conflict at this point. Or that certainly we are at such a disadvantage in terms of the current diplomacy that's being engaged in with respect to the conflict in Syria that it's hard for us to envision an outcome that actually makes things better in Syria. So again, my own view is that keeping some degree of presence in Syria allows us to at least have eyes and ears so that we are aware of threats before they become too proximate. And if we pull out, we find ourselves blinded. It's usually those places in the world where we are not physically present where threats can gather most acutely.
Right, and that was the case in Afghanistan, of course, under the Taliban before the 9/11 attacks.
Exactly.
I'm going to bring you back to the United States. Cynthia Samuels asks about the domestic terrorism, and she's asking specifically about whether or not a lot of the terrorism is driven by anti-Semitic rage. And she asks, how high is that danger? And really the question of, which is one that we've faced in the 20th century in so many venues, so many countries, is this question of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic rage.
Well, certainly hate-based ideologies, including anti-Semitism and white supremacy, are not new and have featured in the American experience for many, many years. What to me differentiates now from previous periods in our history, though, is that the way in which these ideologies can spread and can be shared rapidly through these tools of modern communication that Marcus, you were describing earlier, the idea that a totally wrong-headed conspiracy theory can easily be propagated and spread and be treated as fact simply because you're reading it on the internet or you're reading it on some platform or vehicle that you trust. And there isn't any way for, in a sense, content control to adequately police that environment. So the ideologies are still there. They can just spread and take root much more easily and much more rapidly than they could before. And that's what worries me. And then if you overlay that with kind of our general toxic political climate right now, where almost everything is posed in terms of us versus them, or for or against, or enemy or friend, it just drives individuals into a mindset that kind of goes beyond just thinking that someone is not as good as you, or not worthy of protection, but someone is actually being painted as hostile to you and as a threat to you. So again, I think we read about this with the individual who carried out the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. He honestly, or at least on paper, seemed to believe that the individuals in that synagogue were supportive of immigration measures that were going to destroy this person's life. So he viewed the people in that synagogue, elderly worshipers, as somehow posing an existential threat to his own life and his own community. Crazy view, but held firmly in his head. And how do you get inside the kind of information loop that allows that person to reach that conclusion? That's a really hard problem.
Right, and it seems that what you said is we need to actually move away from some of the polarization and the division that we have within our country so that we can unify as a people. It seems that I also heard from you the need to really develop community structures and relationships, and as well as an understanding of our fellow man, so that we can really be able to help each other in the process as we're trying to confront
these aren't necessarily
issues.
Washington solutions.
In fact, it seems the farthest thing from a Washington
Exactly.
solution at times. But they really are human solutions. It's
Sure.
what you referred to as the soft approach to what it is, which are very hard problems,
Mm-hmm.
but that they really are the human aspects of all of this. When we talked about this earlier, it's really how do you defeat an idea, and this or many ideas
Right.
in this instance. It's not strictly a particular idea in the religious sense or in the sense that there is an anti-national sense of a nation that's trying to attack us with.
And again, this is where I think when we've gone wrong with strategies in the post 9/11 period, it's because we've set, in a sense, almost too ambitious a set of objectives. We are going to go somewhere and solve problems that Afghans have. We are going to fix Afghanistan. We're going to fix Yemen. We are going to fix Somalia. We're going to fix this place or that place. And inevitably, the degree of global superpower that we are, we have tremendous capabilities, but those capabilities often fall short of being able to deliver that kind of outcome, and certainly not that kind of outcome on a time scale that we would, consider reasonable. I think during my period of time in government over the last half decade, I probably attended somewhere around 60 or 70 meetings in the White House Situation Room focused on the country of Yemen. If you would have looked at measures like GDP or global importance politically, Yemen wouldn't measure up on almost any scale of being a prominent place where U.S. interests are at play. But in the terrorism-related world, there's a whole lot going on there. So we were devoting a tremendous amount of time and attention to events in Yemen. And yet today, by any objective look at it, we're no better off in Yemen today than we were at the period of 9/11. And it's not for lack of trying. Strategies, resources, assistance programs, all of those tools have been applied, but they've been applied in ways that didn't produce ultimately the outcomes that would kind of eliminate the extremism problem on that part of the Arabian Peninsula. So not to generalize from that one experience, but to me that's always been a bit of a cautionary tale in terms of when you think about articulating strategies. You remember President Bush, our GWAT, our Global War on Terrorism strategy. We were going to global coalition to defeat terrorism everywhere. That's a pretty ambitious objective. And when you don't achieve your objective, have you failed? Well, or do you just have to adapt to more realistic objectives? And those realistic objectives can include words like manage or mitigate or preempt or cope. And those aren't particularly soaring rhetorical concepts. They don't bumper sticker very well. But in some ways, they're more realistic in terms of how to think about, again, it gets to your keep calm and carry on approach to terrorism.
So that's it, folks. We've now had our expectations reset. The solution to terrorism is not going to happen overnight. In fact, there is no solution. There is no ultimate defeat of the scourge. But keep calm and carry on. Don't bowl alone. And thank Nicholas Rasmussen for the work that he does in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere.
Thank you.